I'd like to share in a somewhat haphazard fashion a series of ideas with you. There is a number of connections between my presentation and Ted's, and one of the slides that you showed was something that sparked my interest in urban design and shifted my focus from individual buildings to the broader environment. It was a slide of the heroic planner in London. I spent a professional year as a student working in London, and I'd been reading a lot of the research produced by the Mars Group, which, if I remember rightly, was the Modern Architectural Research Society group for redesign of London. And I started to visit the places that they wanted to demolish, and I thought, these are rather good places. Why would you want to demolish them? And then I thought, oh, there must be something wrong with me. This is when I had less confidence. I don't understand what's wrong with these places. So there was that connection, and there'll be some slides which overlap ones that you've seen already. I look at things from an urban designer's viewpoint, and the basic point is that urban design is design. And I take the standard definition of urban design as large-scale project design. It may be total urban design, where one group is involved in everything from beginning to end, or maybe a situation where there's a master plan and guidelines are developed to achieve a particular end. Or sometimes it may be what I call plug-in urban design, of putting elements into the environment to act as catalysts for change. Or alternatively, urban design is public policy. But the major question is, so what from all this information? What can I draw on? What should be shaping what I'm doing? So, what are the variables of concern? How important are they? And ultimately, who cares? When we talk about place in urban design, generally we're talking about a locale, but it also we're concerned with designs being in a temporal place and also with status hierarchies. And there's very often a clash between wanting to be modern and wanting to maintain a sense of locale. I have found it useful, and I think all of us are biased by our training. My postgraduate work was at Cornell University, partially under the direction of James Gibson, the perception psychologist. But he recommended that I take a course in social psychology with Professor Lambert, and I was introduced there to the concept of behavior setting. This is a very small part of the course, but it was the one aspect of it that I said, I can really immediately use this, because it's very similar to the work that I was involved with in programming for new buildings, writing briefs for new buildings, and where we use the term activity site. We're talking about a recurrent pattern of behavior and the people involved, the pattern of the environment which affords that behavior, again borrowing from James Gibson's term affordance, and for a time period. And one of the studies that Roger Barker conducted with a colleague, Phil Shoggan, was a comparison between a small town in Yorkshire and a small town in Kansas. And what differentiated the two tremendously was the range and types of behavior settings that existed in the two places. I no longer recall the name that he gave the place in Kansas, but I think the one in Yorkshire he called Yorkdale. And a very simple example of a behavior setting where you get settings within settings is Rittenhouse Square. And those of you who read The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs and her study within it of the four Philadelphia squares, that what her description in 1960, presumably 1958, 57, could be applied today with almost no contradiction. Well, again, sort of talking about children and the environment, that Rittenhouse Square is a wonderful playground, although it contains no so-called play equipment. This photograph here, some of you may recognize as being taken on Easter Sunday. So you take any space, public space, it consists of links and what I call places where local activities take place. Links being essentially people moving between one place and another. But you get settings within settings. And the difficulty is to recognize these when it comes to designing. And what should one retain in doing a new design in comparison to what existed before? Skylines may be important in giving a sense of place and identity, and you can probably recognize all these places, except maybe Frankfurt may not be immediately obvious to you. But it's the ground floor that counts. This is a study done in a studio at University of New South Wales in Mumbai, again formerly Bombay, from the Portuguese. And the name of the place has been changed from Elphinstone Crescent to Horniman Crescent, in acknowledgement of the contribution of a British journalist by the name of Horniman to the independence movement in India. The aerial view gives you one feeling for the place, okay? But when you get down on the ground, you realize how fragmented, but also how rich in settings exists in this so-called banking district. It is now being heavily gentrified, which really means you're moving from small-scale items to much larger scale commercial establishments, and many of them now of an international character. Again, a study done locally, Double Bay, tried to get at the richness of settings that exist there in terms of developing any policies that might be generated for the future of the area. These studies are very difficult to do, and they're time-consuming. And when I sort of put on my professional hat, it's much easier to use generic solutions to particular problems than to develop a completely place-specific design. We just don't have time to do these kinds of studies, we're told. And they're arduous, and so on. Now, when it comes to writing a brief for an area or thinking about its future, it's relatively easy to identify the formal organizations. But there's really the communal organizations that give an area its character. How do you identify them without getting out? It's easy to talk to people and they'll tell you what the formal organizations are. But the communal really have to be observed. And the question is, who does this observation, and what do you retain from what you observe, and what you discard? I was fascinated by this study. It's really an academic after-the-fact study of teenagers in an Italian area of Boston, and a very careful analysis of where people hung out and who met whom where. And could these be replicated in a new environment? Okay. And the hypothesis in this particular study was, yes, they can be replicated, despite the fact that the physical settings were very different. They still afforded the types of activities that were necessary for this particular population, or maybe not necessary, but ones which they seemed to enjoy participating in. The trouble with behavior setting analysis, it doesn't get at the physical qualities of the environment in any other way than that they have to afford particular behaviors, particular activities. It doesn't get at their architectural character. So this has to be added on to thinking about the built environment. What are the meanings of places? And very often the meanings are embedded in the history of the place. So, as a designer, I'm concerned with the geographic location, but I'm also concerned with who's doing what and how it represents the work being carried out in a particular era. My basic hypothesis is that the streets are what are fundamentally important in giving a place a character. And this echoes all kinds of observations made by a variety of people over a long period of time. I suspect you recognize the one on the right because it's a well-known example. The one on the left may be more international in character. The character of streets. It consists of the physical setting. Okay? Very often when we think of streets, we think of roadbed and the movement of traffic and making that efficient. But the street depends not only on the roadbed, but also on the footpath, the framing provided by buildings, and what's on their ground floor, and then, of course, the ambient quality. And so we're concerned with streets not only as links, we generally think of them simply as channels of movement, but also as places of local activity. And in one of Holly White's studies, he showed that to say goodbye takes 4 or 5 times. You have to say goodbye 4 or 5 times before you actually move away from a local setting. And one of the things that interests me, particularly in buildings, is that when we design corridors, we tend to think of them purely as channels of movement. Yet conversation after conversation takes place there, and we fail to design for smaller activities taking place within the large activity. So the streets give a place a character. Here are 4 different, very different streets, and the character depends on the way that they're framed, what happens on the ground floor, the nature of movement down the center, and so on. And then we have this question of, well, what is the character of a place? And in a recent study of Venice, at any one time, I've been told there's 300 visitors for a local person, local resident. I don't know where these figures come from or how accurate they are, but if you're there, you're part of a very different world than if you are sort of living locally and enjoying a very different environment. And I was in Rome earlier this year, and it was very much like the scene in current day Venice where all the tourists are. So in much of my consulting work, there's this clash always between people wanting to be modern and also in part of the modern world and part of the local world at the same time. This phrase comes up time and time again. We want to break away from the shackles of the past. We want to create a new world which reflects a new image that we have of ourselves. I've always been an advocate for an empirically based problem-solving approach to urban design. But the almost total response to this is we just don't have time to work that way. Okay? And so we fall into line with certain current paradigms, certain generic solutions. And they can be broken down into 2 broad groups, the progressive utopians and the regressive utopians. The progressive utopians trying to create a new world based on some image of a good person and a good child, and the empiricists looking back and saying, this worked well, why don't we do it again? So we see designs like this today, Dubai creating an image for itself, and we even talk about Dubais. We don't want to be like a Dubai, we do want to be like a Dubai. I was doing some work in Tripoli in Libya not so long ago, and I was reminded that Singapore once wanted to be like Tripoli in Libya. Tripoli today would love to be Singapore. And so we have these images of what we would like to be. And then on the other extreme, we have a project which is now in the process of construction in Tucson, Arizona, where the Adobe type built environment is trying to be replicated. And people apparently who are moving in really enjoy this particular environment. It's a mixture of public spaces and private spaces, following the model of the barrios of the city. And a project which I've followed for many years, Battery Park City in New York. What fascinates me about Battery Park City is the change in designs from the 1960s to the 1990s. Okay? That the first designs were modernist designs of slab buildings, X-shaped buildings, and required hotel standing independently on its own, which is echoed by the work done in Barangaroo of trying to isolate a hotel out as its major feature. This particular design, the final design, which is implemented and is now built out, starting in 1960, being built out in 2012, is based on the areas of New York that New Yorkers love. Morningside Heights, Gramercy Park area, and in particular, those two in particular. A recent project, which is about to break ground, or maybe breaking ground already, Hudson Yards, designed by Con Pedersen Fox, and says we want to be New York. Okay. So the neo-traditional design for Battery Park City is this is the image of New York, but this is an alternative image of New York, of trying to create a place. And this design is partly a response to New York feeling that it's falling behind the world in terms of what is going on in terms of design. So trying to create something which is new. And I have had the presentation from the firm a couple of times, 3 times, and I embarrassed myself by asking who the lead tenant was, and I was told it was Coach, and I didn't know who Coach was. Okay. So there's this question of being in time as well, in time and in tune with a technology, a modern technology. What's the nature of our present culture? And very much also affected by what we're being told are good designs. And these designs are relatively new. The right one for Paternoster Square was not actually implemented. Although it says here that Porphyrius and Associates were the designer, I think it was very much influenced by Ted Simpson, who is one of Prince Charles's favorite architects. The Richmond on Thames design by Quinlan Terry dates from the 1990s. Okay, so in terms of time, what does this mean in terms of getting a place in time? And one of my colleagues when I taught at University of Pennsylvania was John Bluteau, who was a classical architect. Everything he did was what he says the way he says it was totally derivative of the past. He says classicism is always up to date, and so and seemed to get away with it. His clients tended to be very wealthy. Okay, so when we talk about placelessness, the question is for whom, and what are we talking about? And there's this clash again between having a place in a status hierarchy and being sort of locally congruent with the local world. And one of the questions I never got around to asking John Terminer yesterday was Boris Johnson and his effort to make London look better. What was he up to, and what sort of models was he imagining in terms of creating this looking better environment? Talk about placelessness. Well, my hypothesis is that when you build environments like this, we build out, without thinking about it, the richness of behavior settings that exist in more traditional environments. A very close friend of mine spent her early childhood in the project on the left here, and then moved from there at the age of about 6 to Putney, near the High Street, and the worlds were totally different. That the housing project here in Roehampton had a relatively few behavior settings that would engage children, whereas Putney was just full of them, in terms of somebody going to the local shops, in terms of going to the local playground, in terms of walking to school, and so on. And the same comment can be made in the reverse about the other two, that people who had lived in low-rise housing in rich environments were really sort of uprooted and moved into environments which had better plumbing, but lacked this number of settings that the old environments possessed. I've also done some work in Trabzon in the eastern part of Turkey, and in one study which a colleague was engaged in, she was showing houses, traditional houses and modern, and asking people which house they would prefer to live in. And much to her surprise, they all chose the modern. And eventually she worked out that they weren't looking at the houses at all, they were predicting what the plumbing was like, and were opting for the better plumbing rather than the richer environments. So a couple of observations. One is this one about fewer behavior settings in the newer environments than the old, and the result was not purposeful, and plumbing was certainly an issue. And this echoes some slides we've already seen. Two places in the United States, both taken in the first decade of the century, and are clearly of an era and of a technology. And it's a technology of automobiles and refrigeration. And the question is, does it really matter? Two places, and as I said, we developed generic solutions. Well, one generic solution now are areas with fountains which spout up. And so you can look at any number of new developments, new squares around the world, and they have fountains like this. And a disproportionate number of them, they're no longer working. But in both of these cases, they're working. The difference between the two is that in the one on the left, it's clearly a destination. That children have been brought there specifically to play around in the water. And the other one seems to be children have just seen the opportunity of getting involved and enjoying themselves. The one on the left is a square which has just been built, this Granary Square in London, which is part of a much larger scale development. The one on the right is Pittsburgh Glass Place in Pittsburgh. One of the things about environments is if they're not hard architecture, they get changed by residents over time. To the best of my knowledge, the only purposefully designed Chinatown in the world is the one in Singapore. All the other Chinatowns have resulted from a particular population taking over an existing area and then personalizing it. The one on the right is an area which has fascinated me for a long time. It's a standard Philadelphia row house environment, which has, in this case, been Italianated by the application of certain features. Interestingly enough, the area is now being gentrified. And in gentrification, the first thing that gets removed are the canopies and very often the changed cornice lines, which have now been returned to what they once were. As a result of gentrification, the population in Bella Vista has plummeted. Okay? The number of units has remained the same, but the household size has diminished. And if you go into the area, instead of being full of activity at, say, 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, it's deserted. And so there's much less activity going on, and people live much more metropolitan lives than the people that lived there before. There are all kinds of universalizing tendencies. And I'm borrowing here partly from the work of Chris Olds at the University of British Columbia, talking about the developers who are working internationally, and money is moving around. We see Canadian money in San Diego, we see Hong Kong money in Vancouver, and then we see ideas getting transplanted to Toronto and elsewhere. The number of firms doing much of this work is relatively small, but they provide the model for others to follow. The other thing is the design education now follows essentially the same paradigm. And I was in India, in Jaipur, 2 or 3 years ago, on the jury for reviewing the theses, the design theses, the best design theses of all students in India. And I could just as easily have been looking at the work submitted at the University of New South Wales. Then we're talking about the built forms of global aspirations. And again, a particular firm working internationally, a Shanghai firm doing a design for Ahmedabad, which is the largest city in Gujarat in India, and essentially taking the same model and applying it in an area where the climate is very different, and at the present anyway, modes of transportation are very different. That you very seldom see camels on the streets, and very seldom see human-drawn vehicles on the streets in Shanghai. One of my favorite signs in Ahmedabad is at Nehru Bridge. There's a little round sign with an elephant on it and a cross through the elephant. When we look at this whole issue of what should be done, it's very easy for us to look at it in an international way, and we travel internationally, but a disproportionate number of people still lead remarkably parochial lives. And in most of my life, I was just talking to somebody about that, I've lived a remarkably parochial life. I may have moved around a lot, but once I'm in a place that my children have been able to walk to school, I've been able to walk to work, I've been able to walk to shop, I've been able to walk to recreation. That everything has been on a very localized scale. And even when I look at Sydney, and I look at my orbit of movement, it's remarkably small. And again, a project which has fascinated me, a design for a new central business district for a city in Saudi Arabia, and two designs showing very, very different views of what should be done. I've shown the slide to students, or some variety, some adaptation of the slide to students around the world, and almost automatically they can't imagine anybody, any juror selecting this design in comparison to this design. That the idea of being modern and being global is very much a factor in the way that we deal with education and the way that we develop the values of students. So my conclusion is that if you really want to design for a locale, there are all kinds of things fighting you. But if we design with the natural ecology of the site in mind, which is the paradigm developed originally by Ian McHarg, if not originally by Ian McHarg, certainly not originally by Ian McHarg, but sort of developed by Ian McHarg and now by the landscape urbanists. You design with climate in mind, which is again easy to say, dealing with the spacing of buildings, that if you're dealing with design in the tropics, the economic pressures to not deal with climate in mind are huge. Trying to identify the behavior settings which are important and which will persist and have value in persisting, to me is important, but also thinking about the changing world and new behavior settings that might be created. Focus on the public realm, streets, squares, and other open spaces. But all this clashes with our desire to be fashionable. So I've presented you with a set of haphazard ideas, as I said, but I do approach the topic from a question of what should I do? Or in terms of my educating students, what should they be doing? And I also fully realize that it'll be 20 years before they really are in control of doing anything. So we're dealing with a changing world, but how do we deal with that becomes fundamental. Thank you very much.